Let's begin. But first, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Sky High Stories. She stopped mid-step, the noise of the place dissolving into a dull hum as her eyes locked onto a familiar silhouette across the open space. Laughter echoed around her, children's voices mixing with the scrape of chairs and the rustle of movement, yet none of it reached her. There he was, her husband, standing only a few yards away in a place she never expected to see him at this hour. He leaned down toward the child beside him, his hand resting too naturally on the small shoulder, his body angled inward as though the rest of the world had vanished. The stepchild looked up at him with an intensity that felt unsettling, their heads close together, sharing something silent and secret. It wasn't simply affection. It was the way he smiled, soft and unguarded, the way his fingers lingered, the way their space seemed sealed off from everyone else. Her breath hitched sharply, catching in her chest. Her fingers curled around her bag strap, knuckles whitening as a tremor ran through her hands. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs, each beat loud enough to drown out reason. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that she was tired, that love sometimes twisted perception. But her body knew before her mind could argue. A single thought repeated itself, cold and undeniable. This is wrong. Everything she believed about her marriage, about trust, about the man she shared her life with, cracked in that instant. Memories rearranged themselves, old conversations taking on darker meaning, small discomforts suddenly screaming for attention. Time seemed to pause around her completely. She didn't move closer. She didn't call his name. She simply stood there, frozen, watching the truth rise uninvited to the surface. In that moment, she knew there was no going back. Before that moment shattered her certainty, her life had been built on faith. Faith in love, in commitment, and in the quiet promises people make without speaking them aloud. When she first married him, she stepped into the relationship with a hopeful heart, believing that honesty and effort could soften any rough edge. She trusted easily then, pouring herself into the marriage with the conviction that emotional investment was not a risk but a duty. Love, she believed, grew stronger when it was given freely. Becoming a stepmother had not frightened her. She welcomed the role with patience and sincerity, understanding that love did not always arrive fully formed. She made space for the child in her routines and in her heart, learning boundaries slowly, carefully, determined not to overstep yet never to withdraw. She attended school meetings, listened more than she spoke, and accepted that blending a family required humility. Even when she felt like an outsider, she reminded herself that consistency would eventually build trust. Her sacrifices accumulated quietly, almost invisibly. She paused her career plans when the household needed stability, telling herself there would be time later. She swallowed words during arguments, choosing peace over confrontation, convincing herself that silence was maturity. When doubts surfaced, she buried them beneath understanding, explaining away moments that unsettled her because she did not want to become suspicious or unkind. Emotional compromises became second nature, each one justified by the belief that marriage demanded flexibility. At the core of her choices was a deep belief that love required endurance. She had grown up hearing that commitment meant staying, even when things felt uncomfortable, even when clarity seemed just out of reach. Walking away, in her mind, was synonymous with failure. So she stayed attentive, loyal, and present, holding the family together in ways no one openly acknowledged. Her moral compass was steady, shaped by empathy and restraint. She valued honesty, boundaries, and responsibility, even when others treated those values casually. She gave the benefit of the doubt because she believed people deserved grace. That depth of feeling, that unwavering sense of right and wrong, was what made her love genuine, and what would later make the betrayal unbearable. Her husband's past had always been a quiet presence in their marriage, acknowledged but rarely examined. He spoke of his previous marriage with a careful neutrality, offering just enough detail to explain its end without inviting questions. The stepchild entered her life as part of that unfinished history, a living reminder of a chapter that had never fully closed. From the beginning, she accepted that role with sensitivity, understanding that the child carried emotions far heavier than their years. At first, The bond between them seemed natural. He was attentive, deeply involved, protective in ways that appeared admirable. He insisted on being present for every small moment, every decision, every shift in mood. When she hesitated or suggested giving the child more independence, he brushed it aside, calling her concerns unnecessary. He framed his closeness as responsibility, as a father trying to make up for loss, and she wanted to believe him. There were moments, though, when the boundaries felt blurred. Private conversations ended abruptly when she entered the room. Doors closed softly but deliberately. He grew defensive when she asked simple questions, his tone sharpening just enough to make her retreat. She told herself it was stress, unresolved guilt from the past, or her own insecurity. Questioning him felt like questioning his love for his child, and she refused to be seen as the woman who interfered. Secrecy crept in quietly. Phone calls taken in another room. Plans changed without explanation. Emotional distance settled between them, subtle but persistent, like a thin wall she could sense but not touch. When she reached for him, he was often distracted, preoccupied, present in body but absent in spirit. She blamed routine, fatigue, the natural ebb of long-term marriage. The stepchild's behavior shifted as well. Once open and expressive, they grew quieter, watchful. At times they clung to him with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, at other times withdrawing completely, eyes avoiding contact. She noticed confusion written in small gestures, tension carried in silence. Still, she said nothing, choosing patience over suspicion. Yet beneath her calm acceptance, unease began to take root. It lingered in the pauses, in the unspoken, in the feeling that something delicate and dangerous was unfolding just beyond her understanding. She stood rooted where she was, the present moment stretching unnaturally thin as her eyes took in every detail she had tried for so long not to see. The space around her seemed ordinary, people moving, voices overlapping, life unfolding without pause. But her focus narrowed until only the two of them existed. Her husband's posture was relaxed in a way she had not seen in months, his shoulders loose, his body leaning instinctively toward the child beside him. He was not guarded. He was not distracted. He was fully there. His hand rested at the small of the stepchild's back, not briefly, not casually, but with a familiarity that felt intimate. When he spoke, his face softened, lips curving into a smile that reached his eyes, a smile she once believed belonged only to her. The child tilted closer, their arm brushing his, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of long habit rather than coincidence. They shared glances, quiet exchanges, moments that excluded the rest of the world. The distance between them was almost non-existent. Too close. Close enough that she felt the wrongness settle heavily in her chest. Her throat tightened as though her body was bracing itself for impact. She became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, loud and erratic, each thud echoing in her ears. Her breath turned shallow, uneven, and she had to remind herself to inhale. The sounds around her dulled, fading into something far away and unreal. Laughter became muffled, footsteps slowed, time itself seemed to stutter. She felt detached from her own body, as if she were watching the scene through glass, powerless to intervene. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, a physical reaction she could not control, even as her mind struggled to keep pace. There was no single dramatic act, no undeniable gesture that demanded explanation. And yet, clarity descended with devastating precision. It was the way he looked at the child, unfiltered, unthinking. The way the child responded, neither surprised nor hesitant. The ease of it all stripped away every excuse she had ever made. This was not something new. This was something established, lived in, hidden in plain sight. She did not call out. She did not step forward. Confrontation suddenly felt unnecessary, almost irrelevant. What words could reach a truth already carved into her awareness? Proof would not change what her intuition had finally named. In that suspended moment, memories aligned painfully, defensiveness, secrecy, distance, each one snapping into place like pieces of a puzzle she had refused to complete. Her chest ached, not with anger, but with a profound, hollow grief. The life she believed she was living slipped away quietly, replaced by a reality she could no longer deny. She understood then that some realizations arrive without warning and leave no room for doubt. One look was all it took. She turned away before either of them could notice her, her feet carrying her forward on instinct alone. Physically, she left the place behind, blending back into the flow of people, her posture steady enough to disguise the fracture happening inside her. Emotionally, she remained frozen in that moment, her mind tethered to the image she could not unsee. Every step felt automatic, as though her body understood the need to escape long before her heart could accept why. Disbelief battled fiercely with instinct. She told herself she was overreacting, that exhaustion and imagination had conspired to betray her trust. There had to be another explanation, one that preserved the life she knew, the marriage she had defended even in her own thoughts. Yet beneath those rationalizations, something older and stronger pressed forward. A quiet inner voice insisted that what she felt was not paranoia, but recognition. Guilt followed quickly, sharp and relentless. How could she even allow such thoughts to form? What kind of person questioned her own husband in this way? She felt ashamed for suspecting, for interpreting something so serious without spoken proof. At the same time, fear coiled tightly around her chest. Fear of being wrong and destroying everything with unfounded doubt. Fear, more terrifying still, of being right and realizing everything she loved was built on a lie. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as the scene replayed itself with merciless clarity. The posture, the closeness, the look on his face. Each replay sharpened rather than softened, refusing to blur with time. When she closed her eyes, it returned. When she opened them, the silence felt heavier than sound. Hours passed with her caught between self-reproach and dread. She examined every memory, every overlooked moment, searching desperately for reassurance. Instead, patterns emerged. Her intuition, once gently whispered, now spoke with insistence. The more she tried to silence it, the louder it became, steady and unwavering. By morning, she understood that denial could no longer protect her. Whatever came next, she would not be able to unknow what she now felt in her bones. The breaking point did not arrive as an argument or a confession. It came quietly, in the stillness of her own thoughts, where excuses could no longer hide from truth. She did not confront her husband, because she understood something deeply unsettling. No explanation he offered could undo what she now knew. This was not about catching him in words. It was about facing herself. She sat alone, replaying her life with a clarity that felt both painful and cleansing. Every compromise she had made, every time she chose peace over honesty, rose to the surface. She realized that staying would require her to continue pretending, to silence the voice that had finally learned to speak. Remaining would mean betraying her own sense of right and wrong, dismantling the moral boundaries she had spent her life honoring. There was no explosive anger in her decision, no dramatic tears or accusations. Instead, there was restraint, measured, deliberate, and heavy with understanding. She recognized that reacting in fury would only tether her further to a situation that already drained her dignity. Emotional maturity demanded something harder than confrontation. It demanded resolve. She acknowledged the grief without allowing it to paralyze her. She allowed herself to mourn the marriage she thought she had, the future she had carefully imagined. But she refused to mourn at the cost of her self-respect. In choosing herself, she was not abandoning love. She was redefining it. Love, she realized, could not exist where truth was absent and boundaries were violated. The decision to leave formed slowly, then settled with unmistakable certainty. It was not an escape. It was a step forward. She understood that walking away without shouting, without demanding answers, was not weakness. It was strength refined by clarity. Silence, in this moment, was not submission. It was sovereignty. As she prepared herself for what lay ahead, fear lingered, but it no longer ruled her. Beneath it grew something steadier. Courage. The courage to honor her intuition. The courage to choose integrity over comfort. The courage to walk away from a life that no longer aligned with who she was. In that choice, she reclaimed herself. Walking away was not the end of her story. It was the moment she finally stepped into it. She packed quietly, choosing only what she needed, her movements deliberate and restrained. Each item she folded or set aside carried a memory, shared mornings, familiar routines, a life once filled with meaning. She avoided the objects that held too much emotion, leaving behind photographs, gifts, and reminders of promises that no longer felt real. Letting them go felt like surrendering a version of herself she had outgrown, even if it still hurt. There was no formal goodbye. No final conversation to grant closure or absolution. The absence of explanation weighed heavily on her chest, a silent ache that followed her through every room. She understood that walking away without speaking would leave questions behind, but she also knew that answers could not restore what had been broken. Some endings, she realized, did not offer clarity, only release. When he sensed the change, his reaction was muted but unmistakable. Confusion clouded his expression, denial flickering briefly across his face. He asked questions that danced carefully around the truth, questions she chose not to answer. His uncertainty did not move her. She had already crossed a line within herself that words could not redraw. She refused to argue, refused to justify her decision or defend her silence. Explanation would invite debate, and debate would imply that her boundaries were negotiable. Instead, she held on to stillness, allowing her calm to speak where language would fail. Silence, in that moment, became her strongest declaration. The pain followed her as she left, heavy and undeniable. It settled in her chest like a bruise, tender and persistent. Yet beneath it, something unexpected surfaced, relief. Relief that she no longer had to question her instincts. Relief that she was no longer complicit in her own erasure. Relief that the weight of pretending had finally been lifted. As she stepped away from the life she once fought to protect, she carried both grief and freedom with her. They coexisted uneasily, each making the other sharper, more real. Walking away without explanation cost her deeply, but it also gave her something invaluable. The space to breathe again, unburdened by silence that was no longer hers to carry. Life after leaving unfolded in silence. The days felt longer, emptier, marked by spaces where noise and routine once lived. Friends asked careful questions she did not fully answer. Others filled the gaps with assumptions, judgments whispered just out of reach. There were no explanations she felt safe sharing, no simple version of the truth that could be spoken aloud. Unanswered questions followed her everywhere, hovering in conversations, lingering in her own thoughts. Loneliness settled in, not suddenly, but gradually, like dusk replacing daylight. Yet within that solitude, something unexpected began to take shape. Away from constant justification and emotional vigilance, she found room to feel without interruption. She allowed herself to grieve honestly, without minimizing the loss or rushing toward strength before she was ready. Solitude became a mirror rather than a punishment. Healing arrived in small, deliberate steps. Sometimes it came through therapy sessions where she spoke what she had never dared to name, discovering that clarity could coexist with pain. Other times, it surfaced in quiet reflection, late at night, when she traced her thoughts back to their origin and questioned them gently instead of harshly. She learned to listen to her inner dialogue, recognizing how often she had dismissed her own voice in favor of keeping peace. Slowly, trust returned, not in others, but in herself. She began to honor the instincts she once doubted, acknowledging that they had tried to protect her long before her mind was ready to understand. Each decision she made independently reinforced a sense of agency she had nearly forgotten. Confidence did not arrive loudly. It grew steady and grounded, rooted in self-awareness rather than approval. The stepchild remained in her thoughts, often unexpectedly. She felt compassion without illusion, concern without responsibility. She mourned the innocence tangled in circumstances beyond a child's control, yet she refused to sacrifice herself to ease guilt that was never hers to carry. Love, she learned, did not require self-destruction. In the quiet aftermath, strength revealed itself not as resilience hardened by bitterness, but as calm endurance shaped by truth. She stood alone, not because she had failed, but because she had chosen honesty over comfort. And in that choice, she found herself again. Slowly, life began to take on a different hue, one shaped not by loss but by deliberate choice. She discovered a confidence that had been dormant, buried beneath years of compromise and doubt. Each decision she made reinforced her independence. From simple daily routines to significant life changes, she moved with the quiet assurance of someone who no longer relied on the approval of another. Emotional clarity became her constant companion. She could now recognize her feelings without being swept away by them, understanding where her needs began and ended. Rebuilding her life on her own terms became both a challenge and a liberation. Spaces once shared were reclaimed as her own. She filled them with books, music, and personal projects that nourished her mind and soul. Hobbies that had been postponed or abandoned returned, not as distractions, but as extensions of herself. Every choice she made reflected her priorities, her values, her vision for the future, a future authored entirely by her. Her career, once sidelined for the sake of others, regained focus. She pursued opportunities she had once feared would be impossible, no longer bound by guilt or self-doubt. Friendships deepened as she sought those who valued authenticity and mutual respect, releasing connections that had felt obligatory or draining. Her sense of self-worth grew steadily, nurtured by the understanding that she deserved care, honesty, and respect as much as anyone else. She no longer measured her life by what had been taken from her, nor by the betrayals she had endured. Instead, she defined herself by the choices she had made, the courage to leave, the strength to heal, the wisdom to set boundaries. Each step she took affirmed that her story was no longer written by others but by her own hand. In the quiet moments, she recognized the depth of her own resilience. She smiled more freely, spoke more openly, and moved with the ease of someone fully reconciled with who she had become. Life had offered her a harsh lesson, yet through it, she had reclaimed her identity, her voice, and above all, her freedom. She was whole, not because she had avoided pain, but because she had chosen herself. In the stillness of her new life, she often reflected on the moment that had changed everything. That single look, the one that revealed what words could not, had shattered the illusions she once clung to. Yet she realized now that it had not destroyed her, it had awakened her. Not every truth requires confrontation, not every betrayal needs explanation. Some truths demand courage, patience, and the willingness to act even when fear whispers otherwise. She understood that boundaries are not just lines on a page but protections of the soul, and self-respect is not earned from others but claimed from within. Listening to her intuition had been the hardest, yet most vital, act of all. In trusting herself, she had reclaimed control over her story, her choices, and her destiny. The path she walked now was hers entirely, free from manipulation, secrecy, and the quiet compromises that once eroded her spirit. In this clarity, she recognized the paradox of her journey. The pain she endured had sharpened her perception, the betrayal had clarified her values, and the act of walking away had revealed her true strength. She no longer feared solitude because it had become a space for reflection, growth, and unwavering self-awareness. She moved through the world with dignity, unburdened by guilt or shame, guided by the knowledge that she had acted with courage rather than anger. And in her quiet, resolute peace, she carried a lesson that would stay with her forever. One look, one realization, and one decisive choice had been enough to change the trajectory of her life. It had tested her, yes, but it had also saved her. She smiled faintly, understanding that the power to live authentically had always been hers, waiting patiently for the moment she chose to claim it. One look didn't destroy her life, it saved it.